Welcome to my channel, History of Whisper. The F-22 Raptor pilot's voice crackled through Denver Center's frequency with a request that made every controller in the room freeze. Request tactical clearance under call sign Viper Actual. Passenger manifest confirms Sierra Alpha 447, seat 14C. We defer command authority. Before you dive into this story, tell me which country you are from. Comment below. Subscribe now because tomorrow I'm dropping the best story yet. You don't want to miss it. Nobody requests clearance under a civilian passenger's name. Nobody defers command to someone buying peanuts at 35,000 feet. Yet here were two of America's deadliest stealth fighters. Pilots trained to engage threats at supersonic speeds, asking permission to follow orders from a woman the flight attendants had served ginger ale to 3 times without a second glance. The woman in seat 14C hadn't moved when the first engine exploded 40 minutes earlier, showering the Montana wilderness below with titanium fragments that would puzzle investigators for months. She'd simply closed her romance novel, the kind with shirtless cowboys on the cover that made the businessman in 14B smirk condescendingly, and placed it in the seat pocket with the care someone might give a tactical operations manual. Her hands, steady in a way that suggested muscle memory built through years of controlling machinery traveling faster than sound, reached for the call button with mechanical precision. "Ma'am, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please keep your seatbelt fastened," the flight attendant named Derek had said, his smile professionally concerned but ultimately dismissive. The way service workers address middle-aged women in comfortable jeans and university hoodies who blend into aircraft cabins like beige upholstery. He'd already turned away before she could respond, hurrying toward the galley where smoke was beginning to seep through the seals, thin and acrid. The elderly couple in row 13 had been discussing their granddaughter's college prospects for the past hour. Their voices carried that assumption of privacy people adopt when they believe nobody important is listening. "These state schools just don't have the prestige," the woman was saying, her cardigan decorated with embroidered flowers that matched her dismissive tone. "Not like the education our generation received." She'd glanced at the woman in 14C earlier, making that swift evaluative scan people perform unconsciously, cataloging the lack of business attire, the absence of expensive accessories, the unremarkable appearance that suggested someone who worked retail or perhaps elementary education. Certainly nobody who'd ever accomplished anything worth discussing at dinner parties. The young tech entrepreneur in 14A had his laptop open, cryptocurrency charts glowing against his face while he ignored everyone around him with the selective blindness Silicon Valley teaches its chosen children. He'd accidentally elbowed the woman in 14C twice while gesturing during a video call. He hadn't apologized either time, his attention completely absorbed by people he deemed worthy of notice. Which definitely didn't include 40-something women reading grocery store paperbacks on domestic flights. What none of them knew, what the flight manifest listed only as Re-M, consultant with a Denver boarding pass and a Phoenix destination, was that the woman they'd overlooked had more combat flight hours than their entire aircraft's pilot roster combined. Her hands had controlled weapon systems that could paint targets invisible to conventional radar, had executed maneuvers that broke classified altitude records, and had brought billion-dollar aircraft back from missions that officially never happened over countries America wasn't officially operating in. The Pentagon had 12 different medals with her name engraved on them, locked in a vault requiring 3-star general authorization to access. The Smithsonian had requested her flight suit for their military aviation collection 4 times, but had been refused every instance because the missions associated with that suit were still redacted 30 years after completion. Fighter pilot training programs used her tactical decisions as case studies without ever revealing her name, referring to her only as Sierra November in documentation that itself required security clearance to read. Her call sign Viper had become legendary in ways that transcended normal military reputation. Young pilots whispered about the time she'd landed a crippled F-15 on a carrier deck during a typhoon. An aircraft never designed for carrier operations in weather that had grounded everything else in the Pacific Fleet. The special operations community still analyzed how she'd extracted a downed reconnaissance team from behind enemy lines using a transport, helicopter she'd never been certified to fly, navigating terrain that satellite imaging had deemed impossible for rotary aircraft. She'd commanded squadrons that didn't officially exist, flown aircraft that defense contractors publicly claimed were still in development, and executed missions that shifted the balance of conflicts the news media never knew were happening. Her tactical innovations had been incorporated into Air Force doctrine without attribution. Her combat techniques were taught to fighter pilots who'd never heard her real name. Only the stories that grew more impossible with each retelling until they sounded like fiction designed to inspire rather than operational history that had actually transpired. But today, on Flight SA-447, she was just another passenger the crew served drinks to while discussing their weekend plans. Just another middle-aged woman the businessman beside her had categorized as forgettable the moment he'd seen her reading genre fiction instead of business journals. Just another civilian whose presence merited no special attention from anyone aboard this Boeing 787, currently experiencing catastrophic mechanical failure at 37,000 feet over Montana wilderness. The explosion had been mechanical poetry and destruction. The number 2 engine disintegrated in a sequence that sent vibrations through the airframe like a tuning fork struck by a sledgehammer. The woman in 14C had felt it in her bones before the sound reached conscious perception. That frequency indicated turbine blade separation. The kind of failure that sends shrapnel through fuel lines and hydraulic systems that cascades into emergencies aviation engineers design entire careers around preventing. She'd counted the seconds between the initial failure and the secondary explosion. Her internal chronometer, calibrated by years of crisis management, where milliseconds determined whether people lived or died, 3.7 seconds. Too long for simple blade failure. Too short for fire suppression systems to activate, which meant the engine hadn't just failed, it had been compromised. The failure pattern suggested something that made her mind shift into threat assessment mode that civilian passengers never needed to access. The aircraft yawed, leaving the pilots fighting asymmetric thrust that wanted to spin them into a death spiral. Their training was adequate for normal emergencies, but inadequate for what was developing in their wings and fuselage. The woman in 14C felt the control inputs through the airframe's response. She recognized the desperate overcorrection of pilots who hadn't experienced combat damage, who'd never had to fly crippled aircraft through hostile airspace, while surface-to-air missiles tracked their heat signature. Derek, the flight attendant, stumbled past, his professional composure fracturing as he keyed the intercom with shaking hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be diverting to the nearest airport. Remain calm and follow crew instructions." Technical difficulties. The corporate euphemism for "we're falling out of the sky and don't want you to panic." The woman in 14C almost smiled, remembering the time her squadron commander had used similar language to describe a mid-air collision that had sheared off her vertical stabilizer over the Persian Gulf. Experiencing some handling challenges, he'd radioed while she nursed the crippled fighter back to base using differential thrust and prayer, executing maneuvers that flight instructors would later claim violated physics. The elderly woman in row 13 was clutching her husband's hand, her earlier condescension replaced by terror that made her look suddenly fragile. "George, what's happening?" "What do we do?" George, who'd probably never experienced anything more dangerous than highway traffic, had no answers, just empty reassurances that sounded hollow against the aircraft's increasingly violent vibrations. "It's fine, Martha." These things happen. The pilots know what they're doing. Except the pilots were drowning in emergency checklists designed for single-point failures, not the cascade developing around them. The woman in 14C could hear it in the aircraft's behavior, the way systems were failing in sequence, each one stealing options from the cockpit, each one narrowing the envelope of survivable outcomes. The auxiliary hydraulics just failed, she noted clinically, feeling the subtle change in control surface response. They've got maybe 2 minutes before flight control becomes academic. The tech entrepreneur's laptop had crashed to the floor, his video call abandoned as he gripped the armrests with white knuckles, his Silicon Valley confidence evaporating in the face of physical danger his algorithms couldn't solve. He was praying, she noticed, his lips moving in silent desperation to deities he'd probably dismissed as irrational before gravity started making uncomfortable promises about their destination. Another explosion, this one forward in the avionics bay, if she was reading the acoustic signature correctly. Smoke began filtering through the cabin, thin and chemical, the kind that meant electrical fires were consuming systems the pilots needed for navigation, communication, basic aircraft control. The oxygen masks deployed with that distinctive thunk that makes passengers' hearts stop, yellow plastic breathing apparatuses dangling like surreal party decorations at 37,000 feet. "Put on your oxygen masks!" Derek was shouting, his training overriding his terror, helping passengers who fumbled with straps while the aircraft bucked and shuddered. "Pull down firmly. Place over your nose and mouth. Breathe normally. Breathe normally while your aircraft disintegrates around you. Breathe normally while pilots fight controls that increasingly ignore their inputs. Breathe normally while you plummet toward Montana wilderness at terminal velocity." The woman in 14C pulled her mask on with practiced efficiency, the motion automatic from countless training exercises and altitude chambers, from real emergencies and combat zones where breathing apparatus meant the difference between consciousness and hypoxic death. She was calculating glide ratios, mentally mapping terrain below, assessing the aircraft's deteriorating condition against possible emergency landing sites. The pilots would be doing the same, but they were thinking about runways, about airports with emergency services, about solutions that required infrastructure currently dozens of miles away across mountainous terrain. She was thinking about dry lake beds, about highways, about any flat surface long enough to put down an aircraft that was quickly becoming an unpowered glider wrapped in aluminum and composite materials. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice tight with controlled panic that years of professional training couldn't quite mask. "This is Captain Richardson. We've experienced multiple engine failures and are losing flight control systems. We're declaring an emergency and attempting to reach Helena Regional. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing." Passengers assumed brace positions when instructed. Multiple engine failures. The number one engine had just quit. She realized, feeling the asymmetry disappear as both power plants became equally useless. They were gliding now, trading altitude for distance in an equation that had only one answer. They were going down. The only question was whether they'd have any control when they arrived at ground level, whether the pilots could manage a landing, or whether physics would dictate a crash that scattered debris across Montana wilderness like seeds from a metal flower blooming in violence. The businessman beside her was crying, she noticed with clinical detachment, tears streaming down his face while he fumbled with his phone, trying to send final messages to people he should have called more often, trying to compress a lifetime of unsaid things into text messages that might not transmit before impact turned his device into shrapnel. He still hadn't looked at her, still didn't see anything beyond his own terror, still had no idea that the unremarkable woman in the window seat had survived situations that made this look like a training exercise. She unbuckled her seatbelt with deliberate precision. The click of the mechanism was loud against the cabin's chaos of crying passengers and emergency announcements. Derek appeared immediately, his professional mask cracking further as he tried to enforce protocols that seemed absurd given their circumstances. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated. We're in an emergency situation." "I know," she said. Her voice carried that particular timbre of command that makes people's spines straighten involuntarily, cutting through panic like a frequency tuned specifically to the human instinct for following authority. "I need you to get me to the cockpit now." Derek's training warred with his confusion, his mind unable to process why this random passenger was giving orders with the confidence of someone who expected immediate obedience. "I can't do that." "Cockpit secure. Nobody gets in during emergencies." Derek. She'd read his name tag earlier, filed it away in the mental database she maintained of potentially useful information. It was the habit of someone who'd survived by knowing everything about their operational environment. "In approximately 90 seconds, your pilots are going to lose all hydraulic pressure. They're already fighting degraded controls. When that happens, this aircraft becomes a brick with wings. You have 47 passengers whose survival depends on someone getting to that cockpit who knows how to land a crippled aircraft with no engines and failing flight controls." He stared at her, his mind trying to reconcile the middle-aged woman in casual clothes with the technical precision of her assessment. The absolute certainty in her voice suggested experience rather than speculation. "Who are you?" "Someone who's done this before." She was already moving toward the forward galley, her gait automatically compensating for the aircraft's increasingly erratic movements. Her balance was that of someone who'd walked through aircraft during combat maneuvers, who'd navigated unstable platforms while wearing 50 lbs of flight gear. "Get on the intercom. Tell the captain that Viper is aboard and requesting cockpit access. He'll understand." Derek's confusion deepened, but something in her bearing, in the way she moved through chaos like she'd been trained for exactly this scenario, made him reach for the intercom handset. His hand shook as he keyed the cockpit, his voice cracking slightly as he delivered a message that made no sense to him, but that she'd assured him would mean something to the pilots. "Captain Richardson, this is Derek in the forward cabin. I have a passenger requesting cockpit access. She says to tell you Viper is aboard." The response was immediate, the captain's voice suddenly sharp with something beyond emergency focus, something that sounded like recognition mixed with disbelief. "Say again." "Did you say Viper?" "Yes, sir." "She's requesting." "Let her in now." "Unlock the cockpit door immediately." Derek's hand moved toward the release mechanism before his conscious mind caught up, his body responding to the captain's urgency while his thoughts spiraled in confusion. The cockpit door, designed to withstand terrorist assaults, to remain sealed during any crisis, clicked open at a captain's order because a passenger had said a single word that meant something he couldn't comprehend. She moved through the opening before Derek could formulate questions, entering the cockpit with the familiarity of someone returning to a natural habitat after too long away. The flight deck was chaos, warning lights illuminating every surface like a Christmas display designed by someone's nightmares. Both pilots were fighting controls that responded with increasing reluctance to their inputs. The aircraft's behavior suggested they were minutes from losing all authority. Captain Richardson looked up, his eyes widening as he took in the woman from coach, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the civilian appearance with the call sign that had made him override every security protocol. "Your Viper?" "The Viper." Last I checked, she was already assessing the panel, her eyes scanning instrument readings with the speed of someone who'd memorized aircraft systems in a dozen different platforms, who could translate between military and civilian configurations because flight physics didn't care about manufacturer differences. "You've got a hydraulic cascade failure, probably initiated by the number 2 engine disintegration. Shrapnel compromised the primary systems. Fire damaged the secondary. You're flying on backup that's about to quit." The first officer, younger, his face pale with stress, stared at her like she'd materialized from mythology into his cockpit. How could you possibly know? Because I can feel it in the control response. You're getting mushy feedback, delayed reactions, increasing dead zones in your input range. She slid into the jump seat behind them, her hands already moving toward the overhead panel where emergency system controls clustered. When's the last time you flew something with no hydraulics? Richardson's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. Never. Training simulators don't cover total hydraulic failure. We're supposed to have redundancy. Redundancy fails when the same event takes out multiple systems. Combat pilots learned that the hard way. Her fingers were dancing across switches, her muscle memory adapting civilian layouts to military training. She was finding the manual reversion controls that most airline pilots never touched in their careers. You're going to lose all powered control surfaces in about 30 seconds. When that happens, you'll have manual reversion on the stabilizer, differential thrust if the engines restart, and prayer. I've landed aircraft in worse condition. The engines are gone, the first officer said, his voice hollow with despair. Both failed. We're a glider. Gliders land every day. They just don't usually weigh 300,000 lb. She was pulling up navigation displays, calculating glide ratio against terrain below. Her mind was running equations that balanced altitude, airspeed, wind conditions, and distance to survivable landing zones. Helen is out of reach. You don't have the altitude, but there's a section of Highway 200 about 20 mi northeast. Straight stretch, probably a mile long, designed for heavy trucks so the surface can handle the weight. Richardson's head whipped around, his expression caught between hope and impossibility. You want to land a 787 on a highway? You have a better option, she replied. Her tone was matter-of-fact, carrying no judgment, just the practical assessment of someone who'd made impossible decisions when all the good options were already eliminated. You can try for terrain, hope you find something flat enough in mountainous wilderness, probably cartwheel on the first impact, and scatter passengers across a quarter-mile of forest. Or you can aim for engineered surface designed for vehicles. Hope the traffic's light and give everyone a chance. The hydraulic failure alarm screamed its final warning, the sound cutting off as pressure dropped below minimum threshold, and every powered flight control surface froze in its last commanded position. The aircraft lurched, suddenly sluggish, responding to pilot input like a drunk elephant being asked to dance ballet. Richardson pulled back on the yoke, feeling the mushy, disconnected response that meant they were flying manually. Now, that every control input was being translated through cables and mechanical linkages never designed to be primary systems. "Oh, God," the first officer whispered. His hands locked on the controls, feeling the aircraft's increasing reluctance to obey. "This is impossible. We can't fly this." "You can!" Viper's voice cut through his panic like a scalpel through tissue. Sharp and precise and absolutely certain. "I've flown aircraft with worse damage over hostile territory. You've got manual stabilizer control. You've got ailerons and mechanical reversion. And you've got 2 people who know how to fly. That's more than I had over Baghdad in '03 when I brought back a Strike Eagle with no right wing." She was transmitting on guard frequency now, the emergency channel that every aircraft and facility monitored. Her voice carried the particular cadence of someone trained in military communications protocols, someone who knew how to convey critical information with maximum efficiency and minimum ambiguity. Denver Center. This is passenger aboard Sierra Alpha 447, formerly call sign Viper Actual, declaring in-flight emergency. Aircraft has suffered catastrophic system failure. Total hydraulic loss. Both engines failed. Requesting immediate military support. F-22 scramble from nearest alert facility. Be advised. Attempting highway landing on Highway 200 northeast of current position. Need road clearance, emergency response, and tactical air support. The response came through the speakers, the air traffic controller's voice professional but edged with confusion. Sierra Alpha 447, Denver Center copies emergency declaration. Confirm you said Viper Actual. Need verification of authority for military asset request. She rattled off a classified authentication code that she technically shouldn't remember. That was supposed to change monthly, but that she'd helped design the system for. That would light up classified databases across the Department of Defense with a priority flag that normally required presidential authorization. The controller's response came faster. His tone shifted entirely, the bureaucratic hesitation replaced by instant cooperation. Authentication confirmed. Scrambling F-22s from Malmstrom Air Force Base. Fighters will be airborne in 3 minutes. Viper Actual, be advised. Montana Highway Patrol being notified for road clearance. Emergency services positioning for Highway 200 landing site. Richardson was staring at her like she just performed magic, his mind unable to process how a passenger had just summoned military fighters and reorganized state emergency response with a radio call. Who the hell are you? Someone who really needs you to focus on flying right now. She was back at the navigation panel, fingers calling up terrain mapping, calculating the approach path to the highway that gave them the best chance of survival. You're going to start a gentle right turn in 10 seconds. Rate of descent needs to be exactly 500 feet per minute. Any faster and you'll build up speed you can't bleed off without flight controls. Any slower and you won't make the highway. The first officer's hands moved automatically, responding to the authority in her voice before his conscious mind approved the action. Beginning the turn with the delicacy of someone handling explosives, feeling the aircraft respond with agonizing slowness through the manual controls. Every input required physical force, the yoke fighting back without hydraulic assistance, turning flight into a full-body workout where mistakes were measured in degrees that meant the difference between landing and crashing. Too much, Viper said calmly, watching the turn indicator. You're overbanking. Ease it back 2 degrees. Remember, without hydraulics, you're fighting the aircraft's natural stability. It doesn't want to turn. You have to convince it gently. The young officer made the correction, felt the aircraft respond, his movements becoming smoother as he adapted to the new reality of manual flight. Richardson was handling the descent, managing their glide path with the manual stabilizer trim. Each adjustment required careful calculation because overcorrection meant death, and undercorrection meant the same outcome through different physics. Back in the cabin, Derek was trying to prepare passengers for what was coming. His voice steady despite the terror in his eyes as he demonstrated brace positions to people who could barely hear him over their own prayers and sobbing. The elderly woman was clutching her husband. The tech entrepreneur had given up on his phone. The businessman in 14B was staring at the empty seat beside him where the unremarkable woman had been sitting, his mind beginning to process that maybe she'd been something other than ordinary, that maybe his dismissive assessment had been catastrophically wrong. The radio crackled with a new voice, this one carrying the particular confidence of someone flying a machine capable of speeds that broke sound barriers. Someone young enough to still believe in immortality but trained enough to deliver death with precision. Sierra Alpha 447. This is Raptor 1, flight of 2 F-22s 15 miles. Your 6-wheel Angels 25 descending to provide tactical support. Viper keyed the radio, her voice shifting into the clipped military cadence that fighter pilots used when every syllable mattered. When communication efficiency could mean mission success or failure. Raptor 1, Viper Actual, SITREP Commercial 787, total hydraulic failure. Both engines failed. Attempting emergency highway landing. Need road clearance verification, approach path monitoring, and emergency response coordination. There was a pause, a beat of silence where she could almost hear the Raptor pilot's mind processing what he just heard. Recognition dawning as her call sign registered against whatever legends were still circulating in fighter communities. Whatever stories were still told in ready rooms about the pilot who had done the impossible so many times it became expected. Viper Actual. The pilot's voice carried a note of something beyond professional respect, something approaching reverence. Ma'am, Raptor 1 requesting confirmation. Are you the Viper? Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, the Damascus Extraction. Affirm, but let's save the reunion for later. I need you to get ahead of us. Verify Highway 200 is clear of civilian traffic and mark the landing zone. We've got one approach, no go-around capability. I need perfect information. Roger that. Raptor 1 and -2 proceeding to landing site. Ma'am, if I may, requesting permission to operate under your tactical authority. We're yours to command. Richardson's head turned so fast, Viper worried about whiplash, his expression cycling through disbelief towards something approaching awe. The first officer had stopped flying entirely for a moment, his hands frozen on the controls until Viper's sharp eyes forward, maintain your descent rate, snapped him back to the immediate crisis. The controller's voice broke through, carrying that same confusion Richardson was experiencing. Raptor 1, Denver Center, please confirm. You're requesting to operate under civilian passenger authority. Affirm, Denver. Viper Actual is former commander, 57th Fighter Wing, 3 combat tours, more hours in fighters than most of us have alive. If she's taking that aircraft down on a highway, we're following her lead, requesting tactical clearance under her command authority. Denver Center's response took longer, probably while supervisors were called, while protocols were consulted that nobody ever expected to use, while the bureaucratic machinery of aviation tried to process a scenario that existed in no handbook, no regulation, no previous precedent. When the controller returned, his voice carried the careful precision of someone reading from a script someone else had just written. Raptor Flight. Denver Center, you are cleared to operate under Viper Actual's tactical authority. All civilian traffic is being diverted. You have priority handling for emergency support operations. In cockpits across Montana, in air traffic facilities throughout the region, and in military command centers where classified networks connected the defense infrastructure, people were processing what had just happened. F-22 Raptor pilots, among the most elite aviators in the world, flying aircraft that cost more than a small nation's GDP, had just requested permission to follow orders from a woman currently helping fly a crippled airliner with no engines and no hydraulics. Her name was lighting up databases that most people didn't know existed, triggering alerts at Air Combat Command at the Pentagon, probably at NORAD headquarters buried in Cheyenne Mountain. People who recognized the call sign Viper were making phone calls, sending encrypted messages, trying to understand how one of the most legendary fighter pilots in Air Force history was aboard a commercial flight currently attempting an impossible emergency landing. The Raptors appeared off their wing, sleek predators of the sky flying formation with a wounded giant. Their pilots were probably getting their first visual of the damaged 787, seeing the scorched engine bells, the scorch marks trailing back from the avionics bay, and the way the aircraft flew like something broken but refusing to quit. Raptor 1 accelerated ahead, his aircraft a blur of thrust vectoring and aerodynamic perfection as he raced toward the highway landing zone. Viper Actual. Raptor 1 has visual on Highway 200, marking landing zone now. Civilian traffic is clearing. Montana Highway Patrol has established roadblocks. You've got a straight section, approximately 7,000 FT of usable surface. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. When you're ready, I'll talk you down. She was already calculating in her mind, running numbers that balanced aircraft weight, approach speed, touchdown velocity, and stopping distance against the available runway length that wasn't actually a runway, but a highway that trucks used to haul freight across Montana. It would work. It had to work because the alternative was unacceptable. She had spent a career making unacceptable alternatives into mere suggestions that reality could choose to ignore. Richardson, she said, her voice carrying that particular calm that combat pilots develop. That absolute certainty makes other people believe impossible things might actually be achievable. You're going to fly this aircraft exactly like I tell you. No improvisation, no second guessing. I've put aircraft down in worse conditions on worse surfaces. You have the skills. You just need to trust the training and trust me." He nodded, his hands locked on the yoke, feeling the aircraft's behavior through mechanical connections that translated his inputs into control surface movements with all the finesse of a sledgehammer used for surgery. Beside him, the first officer was managing what few systems still responded, calling out altitude and airspeed with mechanical precision, his voice steady despite the fear that had to be screaming in his mind. The highway was visible now, a ribbon of engineered surface cutting through Montana wilderness, looking impossibly narrow from altitude, like a thread that someone expected them to land a bus on while traveling at aircraft speeds. Raptor 1 was orbiting the approach path, his advanced sensors mapping every detail, feeding information to Viper with the precision that military aviation demanded. Surface temperature nominal. No standing water, no visible debris. Emergency vehicles positioned at both ends, ready to respond on your call. Ma'am, you've got about 6,000 feet from the optimal touchdown point to where the highway curves. After that, it's trees and terrain. 6,000 feet to stop 300,000 pounds of aircraft traveling at 150 mph with no thrust reversers, with brakes that might or might not work without hydraulic pressure, with systems that were designed for 12,000-foot runways and normal operations. The margin for error was measured in feet, maybe in inches, the kind of precision that required perfect execution because close enough meant everyone died. Starting final approach, Viper said, her hands guiding Richardson's inputs, helping him fight the manual controls that wanted to kill them through simple physics and mechanical limitation. Airspeed 180, descent rate 600. You're going to feel it want a balloon when we hit ground effect. Don't fight it. Use it to bleed off speed. Flare at 50 feet. Target touchdown 1,000 feet down the highway from the threshold. The ground was rushing up now, the highway growing from thread to ribbon to road. Details becoming visible, the painted lines, the slight crown in the surface. The emergency vehicles clustered at the far end like toys waiting for a disaster. Richardson's breathing was ragged, his body rigid with concentration, every muscle locked in the effort of controlling an aircraft that didn't want to be controlled. Altitude 500, the first officer called. Airspeed 175. Too fast, Viper said calmly. Pitch up 2 degrees. We need to bleed off 10 knots before touchdown, or we'll never stop in time. The highway filled their windscreen, the perspective distorting as they descended, the world narrowing to that strip of pavement that represented their only chance. Raptor 1 was overhead now, his sensors tracking their approach, his voice providing corrections that merged with Viper's instructions into a symphony of controlled crisis management. Altitude 300, drift left to Tudik. You're favoring the right edge. Altitude 100, airspeed 165, descent rate 700. Power. The first officer caught himself. There was no power. There were no engines to advance, no thrust to adjust, only gravity and aerodynamics, and the desperate hope that physics would cooperate one more time. 50 FT, Viper said, her voice absolutely calm, carrying none of the urgency that the situation demanded. Because urgency would make Richard's inputs jerky, would turn controlled landing into catastrophic crash. Start your flare. Gentle back pressure. Feel for the highway. Don't force it. The aircraft's nose came up. The tail dropped. The main gear reached for pavement while Richardson fought controls that barely responded. His hands made micro-adjustments that were measured in degrees so small they barely registered on the instruments. But that meant everything to their survival. The highway was right there, filling their vision, rushing past and then contact. The main gear touched pavement with a shriek of rubber and the groan of structure never designed for the stresses of an overweight landing on an improvised surface. The aircraft bounced, Richardson's hands automatically correcting, bringing the nose down again, the second impact harder, more final, the screech of tires competing with the roar of wind. and the prayers of passengers who could feel through their bones that they were down, but not yet safe. "Spoilers," Viper commanded, her hands already on the controls before the first officer could react, pulling the handles that deployed what little drag-inducing surfaces still responded without hydraulics. The aircraft shuddered, slowing with agonizing gradualism, eating up the highway in chunks of distance that represented their shrinking margin for survival. "Brakes, maximum pressure," she ordered, and Richardson stood on the pedals with everything he had, feeling the wheels lock, feeling the aircraft skid on pavement that was never designed for this, feeling the speed bleed away in an equation written in friction and desperation. They were slowing, but the end of the highway was approaching with terrible mathematics. The curve where asphalt gave way to wilderness grew in the windscreen like a deadline written in trees and terrain. 4,000 FT remaining. 3,000. The emergency vehicles were scattering, getting clear of the path, their drivers probably praying as hard as the passengers. 2,000 F, the brakes were smoking. She could smell it through the ventilation system, the scent of burning composite and superheated metal. The tires were probably disintegrating, shredding themselves against pavement in the desperate friction that was the only thing preventing them from becoming a debris field. $1,000 aft. The aircraft was shaking itself apart, vibrations that felt like the fuselage might separate from the wings, like the structure might fail from stresses it was never designed to handle. But it was slowing. The speed dropping below 100 knots, then 80, then 60. 500 FT, come on, Richardson was whispering, his voice a prayer and a demand, his entire being focused on those brake pedals, on the controls that barely responded, on the aircraft that refused to stop dying despite everything they'd done to save it. 200 FT, the curve was right there, filling the windscreen. Trees stood like a wall that would reduce the aircraft to scattered aluminum and human tragedy if they didn't stop in the next few seconds. 100 FT, 50 knots, then 40. The aircraft was barely moving now, barely alive, held together by engineering and luck and the desperate will of people who refused to let physics have the final word. 25 FT, they stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of superheated metal cooling, by the ragged breathing of pilots who just performed a miracle, by the distant wail of emergency vehicles racing toward them. They'd stopped with maybe 15 FT to spare, the curve of the highway just beyond the nose, close enough that Richardson could probably count individual trees if his hands weren't shaking too badly to point. Viper keyed the radio, her voice steady despite having just ridden an impossible landing to its conclusion. Raptor 1, Viper actual. We're down. Aircraft secure, no fire. All passengers and crew alive. You can tell Denver we're going to need every bus in Montana to get people out of here. Roger that, ma'am. The Raptor pilot's voice carried something beyond professional respect, something that sounded like awe. That was, ma'am, the most incredible piece of flying I've ever witnessed. Requesting permission to remain on station until emergency services have secured the scene. Granted, Raptor, and thank you. Your support made the difference.